So in today's lecture, Rohit Chakravarty, who is a bat researcher currently doing his PhD at the Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin, in Germany, will talk to us about bat surveys in very understudied areas. Now, there are a lot of understudied areas in the world, but the Himalayas is one of those places which is hugely biodiversity rich, but also very poorly understood. And it's a critical area for understanding the evolution of life on Earth, because that's where two huge continental masses crashed together and a huge mountain range rose up. So studying that part of the world is actually critically important to understanding not only how life evolved, but also can give us some hints in how we can actually protect it better into the future. So Rohit, I'm going to hand over to you for you to tell us about stories of bats from an undersurveyed region. Really looking forward to your talk. Thanks so much for coming along.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and thanks to Padma for organizing this. It's great that so many of you could join on a public holiday, both in Europe and in India. And my Easter wishes to people in Europe and in India, and also New Year wishes to whoever is celebrating their New Year's in India today. I can't express in words what it feels like to be talking at the Linnean Society, and especially after what you heard from Sandy right now, that it's almost a home to the study of natural history. I really can't put it in words, but if I have to give you a cricket analogy, I would say that it feels like playing at the Lord's today. So that's what it is. It's a big moment, and thanks to the organizers for giving me the invitation. Today we're going to talk about bats in the Himalayas, and you've already heard that from Sandy. So I'll take you on this journey, which starts in 2016 and 17 when I started doing my surveys in this beautiful part of the world. But before we get into the Himalayas itself, let us step back, zoom out, and look at the biodiversity of India in general. It's a richly diverse country, and much of it can be attributed to the different biogeographic zones that we have in India. There are deserts, there are rainforests, there are islands, mountains, of course, and so all of these nurture such a rich diversity that there are more than 430 species of mammals in the country, of which 131 are only bats. So they make up roughly 30% of the mammalian diversity of India. They're the largest group of mammals found in India. So as rich as this diversity is, it also puts scientists like me in a bit of a debate, because we don't realize. I love studying biodiversity, and I really can't pick in this whole wide country where exactly should I go and study bats. So so the answer to that, actually, scientists who write grants on a routine basis will tell you a lot of scientific reasons to study and to why they study animals in particular places in the world. But somewhere it also lies in what they like, and that is true for me as well. My answers in picking study sites lie in my personal geography. So I was born right here in the middle of the country in dry and hot Nagpur, where I got interested in bats in the unlikeliest of places, because this particular bat was found by my pet dog in the kitchen dustbin. So that's how I saw a bat up close and personal for the first time. This interest carried with me to Mumbai here, a sprawling metropolis, where I started exploring caves and forts with my friends, saw a few other bats that I hadn't seen before. And then I went south to Bangalore to do my master's, where again I started looking for more interesting species like the critically endangered kolar leaf-nosed bat that you see in the photo below. And beyond that, I had done field work in a couple of other places, not on bats and other animals, just to gain some experience, including the Andaman Islands. So when the time came to choose a master's dissertation, I simply had no clue. I wanted to work on bats, but I did not know what about bats will I study. So one of my seniors gave me the brightest advice that I've heard in my academic career so far. He told me that you think of a place where you want to be, and the question will automatically come. And if you're just starting out in your research career, just forget what I say, take it as a joke. It worked for me, it may not for you. And out of all these places, the answer was clear, that I was going to the Andaman Islands. And this is a, a really impressive part of the country. It's closer to Southeast Asia than to India. And over here, I went across the Andaman Islands collecting DNA samples from different species of bats, which we were then to compare. We were comparing gene flow, the level of genetic connectivity in different species of bats across these chain of islands. And I ended up seeing bats that I never saw before in my life. Some really interesting bats, including endemic bats like the Andaman horseshoe bat. In fact, when this photo was taken and published, it was the first published photograph of this bat from the wild. And at the same time, I also came across several instances where this rather uncommon snake was feeding on cave bats. So the first short paper that came out of my master's dissertation was actually on the snake rather than the bats themselves. And after 3 months of toiling in the field and many more months of doing lab work and writing, I finished my master's dissertation. My paper came out much later because I was not in the academic frame of mind, and you can guess why, because I was looking at a photo like this. But another thought crossed my mind when I looked at this photo, and I was 23 back then, and I thought, I'm not using my feet enough. This place looks like a honeymoon. I should use my feet a little more, do something more challenging, be in a place that nobody has explored in India before. And that took me to where this story begins, to Uttarakhand, which is in the Himalayas. And this particular part where the state of Uttarakhand lies. This is where my personal geography brought me, irrespective of what I told my funding agencies. And another secret that I can probably share with you guys is I'm also a bird watcher who cares for his life list. So I needed to be at a place where my life list was ticking. But other than that, Uttarakhand also has some compelling reasons for a bat survey. Uh, First and foremost, it was last surveyed in the 1870s, so that's a good 140 years ago. And this was done by a British army officer during the colonial times. His name was Captain Thomas Hutton. He found 40 different species of bats, including the rare and endemic Peter's tube-nosed bat. And this bat, since its discovery, has only been seen once again. And now Sandy's made my job easier at explaining this point. If you remember what she told about the Himalayas, it sits at an interesting junction where biodiversity from the western temperate region, the eastern temperate region, and peninsular India merge. So it's biogeographically a very interesting part of the world. And oops, I can't see my last point. I think it's about call libraries. There's a small bar which I can't hide, but anyway. So this is about the echolocation call library, and bat detectors are not very easily in use. I mean, they were not used so often in India 5-6 years ago, even now. So not many researchers were going out and creating reference recordings of bat calls that scientists or naturalists could then use later to identify bats simply by recording them. So that was a huge knowledge gap which I wanted to fulfill. If you look at how this area has changed over the years, the change is drastic. Mussoorie, which used to be a British summer retreat, was just a retreat back then, mostly for the privileged class, and now this has become a sprawling city. And around here, somewhere further 2 kilometers down this road, is where the Peter's tube-nosed bat was discovered way back in 1870s. So this requires, how has bat diversity changed with with these changes in the landscape, you can only find out by resurveying a place like this. So we started our survey formally in Dehradun and Mussoorie. Dehradun is the capital of the state. It's a low-lying area. It lies at the foothills at about 600 meters. It's very well fed from the rivers that originate in the mountains. And Mussoorie is a mosaic of dry and wet mountains, dry and wet, yeah, mountains, depending on which side the whether it's the rain-facing side or the rain-shadow side. And when we started our survey, we were first, just this was my first time in the Himalayas. So we were talking to different people, getting information about bat routes and what could be promising places to sample, to survey bats. And this place is one of the finest research institutes on forestry in India. It started during the colonial days. Yeah, and you can see that it's also an architectural marvel because it combines both European and Indian elements of architecture. So when this place is not an institute and or a tourist attraction, it serves as as a film set for a lot of Bollywood movies. A lot of Bollywood movies are shot here, and in this unlikeliest of places, we found bats hiding behind a pipeline, and these were European free-tailed bats, which until then were known from only two sites in India, and both of those were in the eastern part of the country. So there were no records from the western part of the country back then, and we found them right there, hiding in plain sight. And 2 weeks later, we were catching bats in this gorge, where we further caught 30 more individuals of this particular bat. And the paper is here, and you can Google and find it. So this is how things started for us. And now, after working in Uttarakhand for the last 5 years, I can tell you that this particular bat is extremely common. It's also a bat that has a call that is audible. I mean, if you don't have high frequency hearing loss, which I suffer from, but most people can actually hear this bat, and it's found all the way up to 4,000 meters in elevation. Now, when we went further into the mountains, we went to this place called Devalsari. It's a hidden gem. The place is upcoming as a bird hotspot, as a butterfly watching hotspot, but the bat potential of this place was unknown. And it's interesting because it has prime cedar forest surrounded by dry hills. So it's like an island of greenery, and naturally the density of bats, the number of species that are found in that area is quite high. So some of you from Europe would probably find these bats familiar because they look like species that are found in Europe. And so this was one part of the diversity. But on the other hand, coming back again to what Sandy was talking about, the other element of this diversity is completely different. It's more tropical or eastern temperate, or again Southeast Asia, again tropical. So these were three different species that we found for the first time right here in the Western Himalayan region. Now, coming to the place further ahead, further into the mountains, and this is the place where I've focused since 2016. I abandoned, sadly, the rest of the state, and I focused all my efforts in surveying bats in Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. The reasons are twofold. One, it's a relatively pristine part because it's a protected area. On the other hand, it also has this neat elevational gradient, which goes from 1,500 meters all the way up to 4,000 meters. So, and across this gradient of elevation, the forest changes from dense low-lying areas, low-lying oak forests like these, to alpine meadows right at the top of the mountain. And naturally, with this change in habitat, all kinds of biodiversity also change across this gradient. The other thing about Kedarnath is relates to why we've gathered here today, bat appreciation. I was very impressed to see that this place, which is a sanctuary for the musk deer, which is an endangered species of deer, has one of the few, or probably the only artificial bat roost that I know in the country. So this bat house is an important landmark in this place, and it was built by the former director of this wildlife sanctuary, who's very passionate about bats. And it's a different story that this bat house was never occupied. The design is probably completely wrong, or the bats simply do not need a place like that because it's so green around. Irrespective, I think it takes a lot of courage and passion to build something like this in India, which is a country obsessed with large and charismatic animals. So, in order to show our appreciation for this gesture, this place over the years has become our main selfie point and our main group photo point. As you can see, the group keeps getting larger every year. Female representation is a problem, and but if you are an Indian woman bat researcher, or you want to work on bats, and please do write to me. Now coming to the bats of Mandal, there are certain interesting so Mandal is the lowest elevation site in Kedarnath, which starts at 1500 meters. Uh, there are larger rivers in this part of the in this particular elevation, and these rivers further go down and join and I mean they make up the Ganges, which is the holiest river in India. One of the bats that I feel is a flagship species for river conservation here is the Kashmir cave bat. This map is rather old, but there's more evidence that this is a Western Himalayan endemic, this bat, and it depends heavily on rivers because if you see its legs, they are long and it uses those to hunt aquatic insects. And rivers, its main habitats, are now under increasing threat from hydropower projects or increasing pesticide runoff. So this bat to me is an important conservation symbol. On the other hand, there are 4 different species of horseshoe bats living at this elevation, each of them differing in their size and in their echolocation call frequencies. And horseshoe bats can have really high pitched calls. For example, the Blight's horseshoe bat here calls at about 110 kilohertz. That's 5 times beyond what we can hear. And why are they called horseshoe bats? If you look at this photo, you'll see that the base of the this whole thing is actually the nose. So this base of the nose looks like a horseshoe, and the bat emits its ultrasonic calls through the nostrils, not through the mouth. So it's like calling out of a loudspeaker. Another bat that was very rare until now, I mean, still is globally a rare bat, is the Joffer's pipistrelle. It's a unique bat because it's the only bat in this genus. Until now, it was only found in some parts of Northeast India and Southeast Asia, but now we've been catching these bats repeatedly in Mandal, very frequently, and we also catch pregnant females, so these bats are breeding there. In fact, the last year we caught so many pregnant females that one of my volunteers remarked that post-COVID, the bats are also facing a baby boom. Now, when you move higher up to Chopta and Tungnath, which are the higher elevations, just where the tree line ends and beyond that, the diversity is completely different. There are long-eared bats, which again the Europeans would probably recognize. And at the same time, the forest is quite different. Maples start showing up, the species of rhododendrons change, and probably because of that, the Blandford's fruit bat perhaps prefers that area. We've only caught it twice, and we don't know much about this bat. But one of my highlights from the survey was this particular bat called the somber bat. It's found until now, it was discovered rather in 1970s in this part of India, sandwiched between Nepal and Bhutan. And so 30, 40 years later, we've rediscovered this bat in this part of the country. And these are the only 2 records of this bat so far. And in fact, it's quite quite a rare bat because we've worked in the same place for the last 4 years since the survey, and we've never caught it again. So all of these things put together, the survey ended in 2017, sorry, and we caught 35 different species of bats, 9 of which were seen for the first time in Western Himalayas. One bat, which I haven't mentioned here, so you have to go and search the paper to read up about it, was a new record for India and on the whole. And at the same time, we documented the echolocation calls of 32 species of bats. Many of these are also found in peninsular India. So people, so basically, people from peninsular India can also make use of this reference call library that I've put together using these recordings. And this was work done in collaboration with some really nice collaborators, Manuel Rudy and Farah Ishtiaq. And you can read up more about it on the paper. Uh, the call library is also hosted on my blog. If you search for this with my name, you would probably be able to find the link directly. And this has the calls that I recorded in Uttarakhand, as well as some calls recorded from other parts of the country. So taking a step further from there, now that was a survey, and a survey of any kind of wildlife in ecology is always the starting point of research. It is never the end point, because it's only when you come to know what is out there do you realize what questions can you ask beyond that. So for example, now I know that these are the bats found in my study area. The next obvious question is, why are these bats found there? Why is this diversity found in this particular part of the country? And if this diversity exists here, is it uniformly distributed across space? So, for example, does Mandal here have more bats than Tungnath? Likely yes, but are there some different species of bats that I find here that I don't find here? So these are questions that are very fundamental to ecology, and they help you understand not just why the biodiversity exists there, but also how this biodiversity might get affected in future with climate change or with anthropogenic pressures. And this project evolved into my PhD, which I'm doing with my amazing advisors, Christian and Victoria in Berlin, and my Indian collaborators with whom I actually started this project, Anand and Ram. So the first question we've already found answers to, and this is about how is diversity really uniformly distributed across elevations or not. And I'm going to very briefly summarize this. I will skip the technicalities for now, but I'll tell you that, in front of you now, you see 3 different kinds of diversity. I've split diversity into 3 different kinds. Taxonomic diversity is very simple, and this is something that you could all intuitively realize, which is 20 species at one place, 15 species at another place, 10 species at another place. So you're basically counting the number of species, which is also called species richness. Now, the functional part of diversity is not complicated, but I'll illustrate that with an example. For example, if you have a bat like this with long and pointed wings, think of it, if you are a bird watcher, think of it as a swift. A swift glides through the air catching insects. On the other hand, if you have a bat that has broad and short wings, it will tend to fly more like a swallow just by the nature of how it is built. A bat like this can never fly like this because it goes completely wrong in the physical aspects. So swifts and swallows, they both hunt insects in the open sky, but they do it in very different ways. So just by the nature of how they are hunting, does a swallow hunt different species of insects that a swift can never hunt? So questions like these depend on the form of an animal, and that is something called functional diversity. On the other hand, phylogenetic diversity is the diversity of evolutionary lineages. So are these species that are found in one place, are they closely related to each other, or are they distantly related to each other? So these are questions that also have implications on understanding the future of this biodiversity, because when communities, when these animals that we see today, they undergo range shifts because of climate change. So, for example, a species from the lower elevation moves to higher elevation. Species which are functionally similar are predicted to compete more with each other for those few sets of resources that are available to them. So we went on to describe these elements of diversity, and very quickly, the first obvious answer that we got was that species at the lower elevation, there are more species at the lower elevation and very few species at the highest elevation. This was quite obvious, and people all across the world have found this with bats in different mountain systems. But when you look at functional and phylogenetic diversity, the things sort of changed a bit. And I mean, not changed, but there was a discordance. And by that, I mean that the highest elevation, of course, had the lowest level of functional diversity. You can skip all of these metrics that I'm showing you right now. But in summary, this is what we found, that in the highest elevation, the level of diversity, functional diversity, was low. And this is something that ecologists often call abiotic or environmental filtering, which means the environment is filtering certain forms that can adapt to those harsh conditions. But when we looked at phylogenetic diversity, which is not shown here, there was absolutely no change. So much of these patterns were actually associated to the presence of horseshoe bats only in the lower elevations. They have very different traits from each other, but they all belong to one species. So I'm just skipping that. I'm just letting you know this in summary right now. You're free to ask more questions, but if you would better understand this by reading or watching a talk dedicated to this, here are two places. I mean, this is the paper on which the study was based, and if you find this talk on YouTube, it's a complete 10-minute talk dedicated to this study. And with that, I'm beginning to conclude my talk by zooming out into the world. And these are examples of books from Europe, where I'm sitting right now. These books are, I mean, you can find books on various aspects of bats from Europe, because bats have been studied here for so many years. But in India, this is the only book that we have. It was published in '97, getting out of date. It is completely out of print. So, this also, this lack of information that is accessible to people also affects their appreciation and understanding of bats. And that is something that with research, thankfully the bat research scene in India is growing. And I'm pretty confident that in the next 10 years, we'll sort of try to catch up with the European scene. And with that, I will leave you with thoughts, and I will also leave myself with the thought, looking at this map, where would I go next after Uttarakhand? And that's the question that's burning in my mind as I finish my PhD next year. And I would like to thank a lot of people who made these stories possible: funding agencies, my scholarship, institutions where I've worked, and some lovely people who provided logistical support. My field team that has been blessing me with their friendship, has been tolerating my pessimism in the field and putting up with all kinds of situations. And with that, I would like to end, but one final note because it's Bat Appreciation Day, if you want to make better use of your Easter or your New Year's in India, here's a great place to contribute, and cost less than your Netflix subscription, and you would help an organization that has been doing phenomenal bat education and outreach in Eastern Europe. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Rohit. That was absolutely fascinating. And actually, that was the perfect thing for Bat Appreciation Day. I think bats are underappreciated because people kind of people are a bit frightened of them in a very kind of strange way. We've got a few questions. So please, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, because it's really hard for me to keep track of them when they're in the chat. So I'm going to ask you one from the chat, but whoever put that in the chat, please, if you have another question, put it in the Q&A box. So do you think that one single ancestor of these bats might have had, is divergence due to different prey types, or is it convergence because they're living in the same area? So is it about divergence or is it about convergence?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And we are actually finding, so if you noticed, I put down 3 questions related to my PhD. The second question was about actually studying their diets. And now I've only got the data for it. And it seems like the bats are eating completely different things at the highest elevation. So even though, trait-wise, they're not very different from each other, they're eating completely different things. So it's more about, it's more related to their diets rather than their traits.
So do you think that I'm just going to ask another question about that, is do you think that's because there's different insect diversity? So the corollary of that is what we need is a kind of, not just butterflies, but all insect diversity survey to see if there are insects which are kind of functionally the same, but taxonomically different at those different elevations. Has anybody done that?
That's not been done, but we do have samples. I mean, not me, but my wife actually works on moths, and she has samples of moths from these elevations, from the same sites where I've worked, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to do that. So
great.
Yeah, that would make for a very, I mean, that would sort of piece some part of the puzzle.
Yeah. So somebody's asked about an interesting question, which I hadn't really thought of, because I come from a place where there is snow sometimes, is how do bats cope with snow? How do they cope with really cold weather?
That's an interesting question, and we don't really know how they do that in the Himalayas. Well, some bats that are capable of flying long distances, they migrate to lower elevations where there is no snow. But even then, bats are unique in this. They migrate to hibernate. So they don't migrate to, stay active. But there is a chance, well, at least in India, they could, no, but all of North India gets a little cold, so insect activities are low. So bats could be migrating, and then they would be hibernating at a relatively warmer part. But in Japan, they found one of the species of tube-nosed bats, which you might have seen a photograph of in my talk. Tube-nosed bats actually hibernate in the snow. And by in the snow, I mean on the ground. So they dig up, they go to the ground, they make small little ball-like holes for themselves, and then they just completely cover themselves, they blanket themselves with their tail, and they hibernate.
Yeah, that migrating to hibernate is a very interesting kind of concept, because you often think of the migration as being avoidance of having to hibernate. That's absolutely fascinating. Bats do pretty incredible things. So do you think, from your kind of looking at bat diversity across India, do you think there are still species of bats to be described from India?
Definitely. And this is not even talking about cryptic diversity, species that look the same but are genetically different. I have a feeling that in parts, for example, Northeast India, for example, or even the Andaman Islands, particularly the Nicobar Islands, which are between the Andamans and Sumatra, they would definitely have species that we still haven't found.
Yeah.
If you account for cryptic diversity, we are definitely looking at way more species.
Depends on what you call a species then, doesn't it, really?
Absolutely.
Of course. Someone's put a comment in here that, what about urban diversity of bats in India?
Okay, that's a nice question, and also relates to bat appreciation, because, well, you're going to appreciate only bats that you see around you. There is actually a pretty good level of urban diversity in India, and it varies from city to city. If you are in a city like Delhi, which has a rich architectural heritage, you can easily observe species like mouse-tailed bats or tomb bats, which live in these abandoned tombs. On the other hand, green parts of the greener cities like Bangalore have, I've recorded about 5 or 6 species of bats in
Mhm.
university campuses in Bangalore, which are quite green compared to the rest of the city.
Yeah.
And some of these places which have older architecture, like like made during the British times, which have these columns and huge hallways and arches, bats love to hide behind those. So a lot of things contribute to how urban diversity increases or decreases. But at any given point, if you are stepping out of your home in India, you would have at least 3 species of bats flying above your head.
That's fantastic. And I think that's a really important thing for Bat Appreciation Day. So again, on that idea about bat appreciation, is there widespread superstition about bats? I mean, there is definitely in Europe and the United in the global north, people are very suspicious of bats. So do people kill bats, or are they suspicious of bats, or is there what I would call bat persecution?
There is. I think a lot of it is not documented, but bats are quite rampantly used in I mean, in certain ritual procedures and superstitious beliefs, what we
Mhm.
call black magic in India. I don't know if that's a word, if that's a common English word,
Yeah.
but bats are quite strong, quite strongly used in that. Other than that, you see a whole variety of attitudes. For example, in Uttarakhand, where people do not normally venture out after dark because they're scared of leopards or bears. Uh, they simply don't care about bats, and the level of basic knowledge about bats is quite low. But in places like the northeast, where people are actively venturing out in the forest trying to hunt, their knowledge of bats is quite high. So they would be able to tell you
Mhm.
that bats are, they don't suck your blood, but they eat insects. They hide in these places, they hide in caves, they hide in tree holes. So
Yeah.
so the level of awareness also differs all over the country.
No, there's also a question here about and you just said it in that when in your last comment about bats using trees. So if there are there so bats that roost in kind of these old colonial buildings, and these, I mean, there is a use for British colonial architecture, obviously it's for bats, but so are there bats which are specialists on old growth forest trees, and are those in more rapid decline than, for example, bats which are a bit more Catholic in their tastes about where they'll roost?
Yes. Theoretically speaking, yes.
Mm.
The problem is we don't exactly know which species they might be, and the problem is because as you would realize in my talk, we are doing surveys right now. So we have first we are still struggling to find out exactly what species there are in a given area,
Yeah.
and the next step is to try and understand which are the species that might be affected. But from studies that have taken place in the south, in Western Ghats, I can tell you that there are species like false vampire bats, which or the Salimali's fruit bat, which is an endemic species of fruit bat found in relatively higher elevations in the Western Ghats, and those areas are already, they're like they're like cloud forests, so they're already in an island setup. So there's forest in the middle of grassland, and then on the next hillock you again have forest. So naturally they occur in sort of um, uh, disconnected forests. So those paths, if we um, cut down the forest that they live in, then the habitat will become even more fragmented.
Mhm.
So there are just a few species that we know that are actually getting affected by the decline of
Yeah.
old growth forests.
Yeah, so obviously there's quite a lot to be done. So there's various people have said, how do I get involved in bat diversity? And I'll point out that you've put your Twitter handle on your first slide, so they can get in touch with you. You're very easy. You're very easy to find, Rohit. Um, there's a question from someone who asks, do you think that the functional diversity of bats changes in a similar way in the central and eastern Himalaya as to the western Himalaya where you've been working? So do you think there's a similar pattern, just your gut feeling?
Uh, Nobody studied that yet, but my hunch is it might be different. And the reason why I say that is because is based on what we know about from studies on other taxa, for example, birds, which are the most widely studied, we know that most of the species of birds have colonized the Himalayas from Southeast Asia. So they occur in lower elevations in the eastern part of the country, but as they go to the western part, they occur at higher elevations. So so just by the nature of how animals might have colonized the Himalayas in ancient geological time, the pattern would be different because, and in the eastern Himalayas, I suspect that there a lot of speciation has happened in the mid and the high elevations. And so
Yeah.
based on the local processes, and we will only find out once we go out there and study these patterns, but there is a high chance that the patterns in the east and the west of the Himalayas are completely different. And the east is also very tropical compared to the west of the Himalayas, which is slightly temperate.
Yeah, and I was wondering if so this is a question of mine, and I'm just going to butt in and kind of do this. So are these bats actually from Gondwanan lineages, or are they from Laurasian? Are they I mean, who are their closest relatives, or is it a big mixture?
I think they're all Gondwanan, and I don't think and I think this is the typical pattern that you find on with respect to diversity, all kinds of life forms in the Himalayas. Whereas in the Western Ghats, which broke off from Africa and Madagascar, a lot of frogs have their closest ancestors in Madagascar, which may seem very counterintuitive, but that's how it happened. So, but the Himalayas, because the diversity has come about after the mountains were formed and animals from the temperate region and from the Indo-Malayan region colonized them, they all rather belong to one continental landmass.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So someone has asked about how you identify these bats. So so if you catch something, how do you identify it? Do you take DNA samples? What do you do?
It's a combination of characters because bats are really hard to identify. You have to look at a lot of different characters. For example, how are the shape of their ears, how long or short the legs are the wings of the bat attached to their tibia or to their ankle, and there are different. So these are the characters that I first look at, and then I start measuring the bat. After that, I also take a DNA sample, and in fact, the survey was based on a lot of DNA barcoding of different species of bats. But over time, we ran into a problem. After we did the DNA barcodes, I first decided that I'm not going to kill bats, and this is not I'll try to make it as less intrusive as possible. And then we ran into a problem where we had sequences of bats, but we had nothing to compare them to. So we knew that these sequences are new, but we don't know what this bat is. And since then, the species that I thought are genetically new, I've collected one individual of each, and now we are working on. I mean, we'll also have to look at them anatomically to identify them.
Yeah, and that's a really important thing. And it might seem, I mean, oftentimes people who are not in the same field as us, who actually collect things, might feel that that's quite not a good thing to collect, but actually having a voucher of something is actually the evidence that we need for something. And science is about evidence, and natural history is a science. And I think you made that point so beautifully with your description of survey as the start of everything. Is that taxonomy and systematics, that really understanding of what's there, is what allows us to ask more questions and different questions. And the best science of all is the science that leads us to asking more and different questions. So someone has asked a question about the kind of, I'm not quite sure I understand this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is the bat diversity of specialist categories with respect to their diet? So are bats at higher elevations more specialist in their diet? That's, I think, what they're trying to get at.
I think so. Yes, as well as okay, it's a little tricky to answer that question
Mm,
because generalist and specialist are happen on a rather relative scale. I mean, you
yeah.
need, in order to call something a specialist, you need to know how wide or narrow the diet of the generalist is. So, but making these comparisons from the study that I'm currently working on, which is with respect to the diet of the bat, we found that so far we found that the long-eared bats seem to be quite specialist because they are also found in the higher elevations. They also they have a rather narrow dietary niche. So and but the problem here, and this is why I was getting confused, was is that dietary niche narrow simply because the bat is at an elevation where there might not be an assortment of insects, a wide assortment of insects to feed on.
Hmm.
So so in order to call it a specialist, I would really have to know, okay, there are 40 species of insects out of which it is just eating 4 or 5. And but from the data that I can see so far, it does appear to be specializing on a certain kind of insect. And the same thing for tube-nosed bats. They're known to be specialists, or rather not specialists, but they tend to feed quite often on spiders because their echolocation calls are such that they can actually detect a spider through its web. So
Wow,
based
that
on
is
these,
very cool. That is
yeah.
very, very cool. Yeah, and
So
so that
based
brings us back to what we were talking about earlier about the need for more surveys of different organisms, because to really figure out some of these questions, you
Yeah.
need to have lots of other background information. So it's just the tip of the iceberg. The bats are possibly just the tip of the iceberg, but a very charismatic one. And someone has asked a question about what do you think the best thing to do is to to create to create something about bats so that they can become a flagship species for conservation. Do you think there's that possibility, and what's the best way to do that?
I think I think we've got a blessing in disguise here in the form of COVID. It was disastrous when it happened, but right now when you look at it, it's almost like Will Smith slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars. There was bad publicity, but at the same time, it worked for bats. And right now, if you Google bats and COVID, you're going to find a lot of information about why bats should not be blamed for COVID. The reason why I'm pointing
Mhm.
this out is that because of COVID, bats became a household name, and now is the time that we capitalize on that and
Absolutely.
highlight the bigger benefits of having bats around us in order to make people more aware about them. Having said that, we also need a lot of studies on ecosystem services that bats provide. And I know I've seen the participant list. I know a couple of my friends here who are working on how bats control insect populations in chocolate plantations, for example. So these kind of studies are really going to
Mhm.
make bats to give bats a very positive image in the public light.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much to do, and there's lots of questions about breeding systems of bats and all those other things. But I think, as you really eloquently pointed out at the beginning, that that actual survey is something that you start with, and then bats do all kinds of things. So somebody's asked, are bats monogamous? Well, I
Okay.
think probably the answer is it depends on the bat.
I don't think so. No, actually, I mean, again, yeah, like Sandy said, it depends on the bat, and there are so many species. There are over 1,300 species or 1,400 species of bats in the world. Uh, if that question comes from India, one of the most common bats that we have is the short-nosed fruit bat.
Mhm.
That is definitely not monogamous because the male maintains a harem of females.
Yeah.
Similarly, for us, or another common bat, the Indian flying fox, which again mates every other way. In fact, there's also evidence of males giving oral sex to males. So it's a really interesting system to work
Bats are
on.
endlessly fascinating, and there is so much still to study. And I think that's one of the really great things about natural history and studying the natural world is there's always something else that we can discover.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to see if there's not a lot of questions, except that I want to ask one, which somebody asked way back at the beginning, is, so where will you go next?
Um, I don't want to break it out right now. I think otherwise I will lose out on content when I give my next talk.
Okay,
So I don't
that's
want
all
to give
right.
any
We'll let you, we'll
spoilers.
let you, we'll let you, we'll let you. But it's
I
clear that
won't give
there's
any spoilers right now. But I think I would. But to answer that question very honestly, I think I would still maintain a lot of association with Uttarakhand and the Western Himalayas, because that state has just given me too much. I will continue working there, but at the same time, I will, towards the end of my PhD next year, hopefully start thinking about putting my foot elsewhere.
Yeah, no, but I mean that, and it's clear from your map and from your talk that there's still quite a lot to do all over India, and there's plenty of room for lots more bat surveys. And I think that would be a really good way to kind of create that impetus around bats as a flagship species for conservation, which they may not be now, but with people like you kind of in their corner, I'm sure there will be in the future. So Rohit, thank you so much for an amazing talk on what's almost International Bat Appreciation Day, but actually it's Bat Appreciation Day every day. So thanks so much for coming along, and thanks a lot for taking the
Thank you
time
so
out of
much.
this, a holiday in India and a holiday in Europe. And thanks to all of our audience for sticking with us. So thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Okay.